Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. My name is Keller-Scholz, and I work at Parks Tacoma. My title is Planning and Asset Management Administrator, and I'm here today to talk to you about the art and history of Dune Peninsula at Point Defiance Park. So if you're from Tacoma, you probably know a little bit about Dune Peninsula and Point Defiance Park already, but I like to start these presentations with context. So I put together a slide showing the timeline of Tacoma's history in very broad strokes. You'll notice along the top of the timeline is a blue line showing the presence of Puyallup and other Coast Salish peoples. We know that Indigenous people have called this area home since time immemorial, and they are still here. Parks Tacoma does have a land acknowledgement where we do acknowledge that, again, this is the Coast Salish land, and we are proud to continue their legacy of stewardship, knowing that we are only one small part of the story. You'll notice on that slide there's also a pink line showing when non-native settlers started in this area, and there's also some other timeline notations about developments, including the exploration by Captain Vancouver, a British explorer. We also have the settlement of Fort Nisqually, a little farther south than we are, Dupont, Washington, and that began in the 1830s. You also see we have the American explorer, Wilkes, with the USXX coming into these waters in the 1840s. 1841 he was here, and in fact gave us the name of Point Defiance by notating that this would be a very excellent place to defy any invaders looking at that choke point of the Narrows. There's also a notation on that slide about the beginning of the sawmills in Tacoma. And the first sawmill was begun in the 1850s by an incoming settler. The legacy of sawmills continues up to the 1970s when the last functioning sawmill on Ruston Way shut down. And that would be the Dickman Mill, which is also now a park today. And finally, this story we're talking about involves the waterfront, so I included on the slide the recreational history of the waterfront in Tacoma, and that really gets going about the 1960s. However, Dune Peninsula goes back much further. Of course, as I mentioned, this was the home to Indigenous people and still is their home today. This is a slide showing the village sites that we know were here and occupied by Puyallup. This slide was a result of the work of Chris Ehrlich, curator at large, who put together an exhibit about the Puyallup and their story here for the Foss Waterway Seaport. This graphic was also used at Owen Beach when we did the new developments there, and we are very thankful for the contributions from the Puyallup Tribal Historic Preservation Officer, Brandon Raymond, and the work that we've been able to collaborate with them in terms of telling this story through a sign down at Owen Beach. So if you've been down to Owen Beach, you might have seen this sign, and this is a great graphic for showing how many village sites were around here, and that there was in fact one quite near Point Defiance Park. Actually, there's two that we know of. Owen Beach, we were able to determine was also the site of a village. That the name of that particular beach landing area was Kokokwa Jali, which means place where there is water, and that refers to the hillside springs. Place of drinking, I believe, but it refers to the drinking water that was available through the springs. How did we get to Tacoma, knowing that there were already people living out here? Well, that history kind of came out of the middle of the 19th century. So you have the 1840s, where Washington and Oregon were opened up for settlement with treaties signed by the U.S. and Great Britain. The boundary line for American territory and for English Canadian territory was drawn in 1846, where pretty close to where it is today. And so this was all American territory. Up to that point, it was jointly occupied, and there was still some question about whether it would be English or American territory. In the 1850s, the U.S. government began enforcing treaties to be signed by local governors and the native population. So Governor Isaac Stevens was really hot on this. He wanted to have treaties signed, get the land away from the native peoples and be able to develop it. And so we came with the Medicine Creek Treaty of 1855 That was a travesty in many ways, but it gave us what we have of Tacoma today in many ways. There was a proposition for creating reservations. So you had the Puyallup tribe, you had the Snoqualmish, many other individuals. We're going to edit this part out because I'm getting very distracted and I apologize to all of you. So, 1850s, you have treaties where you have the local native populations being forced out of reservations, forced to sign away their livelihood in exchange for promises that were not kept. In response to this, certain Native Americans resisted with force of arms. General, quote-unquote, Leshai was one of those. He was a Nisqually man who had worked with the settlers up to that point and been a pretty, congenial fellow, trying to be generous with these newcomers. And unfortunately, as a result of the treaties, he saw his future being ripped away and joined with many other like-minded natives from the local tribes to resist through a period of armed conflict that we now call the Puget Sound Treaty Wars. This resulted in the renegotiation of those reservations and of those treaty rights. And so it was a brief conflict, about 8 months, but it had long-lasting impacts, and not only created the reservation pretty much as we know it today for the Puyallup, the Nisqually, it also, Fox Island, nope, sorry, this is harder than I thought for doing a presentation with my notes far away from me, but thank you all for bearing with me. We'll cut this out too. Puget Sound Treaty Wars resulted in new reservations for the native populations on Puget Sound. And if you ask tribal historians today, they will say it actually was a success, because although they did not succeed in escaping the bounds of the treaty, they actually were able to negotiate favorable terms, which included their continued right of access to lands and waters for fishing and hunting that we still are bound by today. It also created a new reservation, not just for the Puyallup and the Nisqually and the Squaxin Island, but the Muckleshoot got their own land as well, where the first round of treaties, they didn't even have a reservation. They were shoved on the reservation with the Puyallup, and so it was an incremental increase in land, but it was better than it had been the first time around. So difficult, complex history, but it's an example of the way that Native peoples have had agency in creating their own futures. So we are helping to elevate that story as part of our role in being responsible stewards of history. But back to Tacoma's history. The history of Tacoma really got started in the 1870s, although it was platted earlier with Job Carr and McCarver. But this is a slide showing you a version of the propaganda that was shared by the railroads when they came to Tacoma. 1878 was the date on this image, and it shows you the kind of idealized version of Tacoma, where you have clear-cut land to build houses and businesses on. There's a beautiful mountain in the background. There's the tide flats wide open for shipping and industry. There was probably a little bit more tree stumps and mud at this time than you see in that picture, but it was the aspirations of come west, come make your fortune here. And in the next couple decades, that's exactly what happened. More and more people moved to Tacoma with the railroad providing access of all this beautiful raw resources, from timber to ores. You can ship it directly to places around the world thanks to our natural deep water harbor. And in the next 2 decades, you saw this boom of industry. So this is a slide showing you all of the factories that were located along Ruston Way, down along the harbor there. Great clouds of smoke and steam would have covered the waterfront on a busy day, and that meant money, and that meant profit, and that meant success to early Tacoma. Thankfully, we had in these early entrepreneurs those who had the good sense to realize, along with all this industry, you also need a place for people to go to escape the steam and the smoke and the rail cars clattering along the tracks. And so they looked to creating a park at Point Defiance. Now, I mentioned Wilkes had come ashore in the 1840s. early 1840s and had given the English name of Point Defiance to this spit of land. It was in fact set aside as a military reserve in the 1860s, and it was never developed, but with that early eye towards defending the early American settlements here, they did keep it protected away from development that happened in the rest of Tacoma. In 1888, the early Tacoma government petitioned the federal government for permission to use this as a park. At that point, it was a whole stand of forest. It had been used for folks for, informal recreation. They would go there to camp or to get away from the city, but there was no formal trails or any kind of amenities there. And so following 1888, the city of Tacoma was successful in getting that permission to use it as a park. And so that was when the park proper began to grow. There were still people, living around the edges of the shore, fishing, making their camping spots. That was cleared up pretty quickly just because as the park got more developed and it had more and more people there, they ran into that conflict of use thing. But there's some really interesting park board minutes from the early days trying to wrangle the skinny dippers and the summer campers who were just kind of setting up tents wherever. So much like Tacoma, it was a little hairy in the early days and then became a little bit more formalized over the decades. In fact, it wasn't until 1905 that the city of Tacoma actually had the title to the land. It was still owned by the federal government up until that point. And so it was really after 1905 that the park became kind of a permanent fixture where the city felt better about putting money into it because they know it wasn't going to be yanked out from under them. This is a slide showing the 1920s view of Point Defiance Park. So this is a point where it's been fairly well developed. But you'll notice there is the town of Ruston in the square that is cut out of the city of Tacoma boundaries. And as we know today, Ruston is still its own municipality. It is the town of Ruston, separate from the city of Tacoma. And that came out of another industrial development along the waterfront, the Ruston Smelter. So I've talked a little bit about the history of Tacoma and the area. I've talked a little bit about the history of Point Defiance Park. Where does Dune Peninsula come into this? I'm glad you asked. This is where we're getting into the part about how this was a man-made piece of land, and it goes back to 1914. So you will see that there is the Tacoma Smelter is on this map, and it was in action starting actually back in 1888. So the same year as the park was given over to the city for use as a park, the smelter got going. Dennis Ryan was the first gentleman to start smelting lead and other metal ores there on the corner of the park. And 2 years later, he's turned it over to William Ruston. William Rust was the one who really made the smelter a success. He introduced copper into the mix, and that was where the big money was. So they were actually able to start smelting, grow the business. It became a very significant international exporter, but it also produced copper for local use as well. In fact, the smokestack of that smelter was a regular feature of the park. This is a postcard, or photo actually, showing what the bowl of Point Defiance Park looked like back around the turn of the century. And you'll see in the background there, tall, skinny, looking kind of like a tree, that was the chimney of this original smelter. Here's another picture of the smelter looking out over the roof line, kind of out towards Vashon Island there. And you can get a sense that this was not just one building, this was a whole complex full of buildings for all the different stages of processing the ore. A smelter would refine raw ore, and the refined metal would then be shipped off to be made into all sorts of things at other factories. And the byproduct of that smelting was what we call slag. So this is the impurities that were filtered out of the usable metal ore, and as a result, you ended up with a lot of byproduct hanging around. This is another view of the smelter, taken from the water, looking kind of up towards the smokestack. There were several smokestacks over the life of the smelter, and we'll talk about that in a second. But I just wanted to give you another angle, and where that smokestack is today is up on the hillside a little bit. Here's a picture of the ore coming off the barge. It would have been scooped up in these small kettles and taken to the actual refining plant at the complex. This is a fun photo actually from the 1930s. There's a whole backstory thanks to the Northwest Room at the Tacoma Public Library for these images. They have some detailed history in a lot of them. This particular image was actually from the 1930s when you had a gentleman overseeing gold being refined as a deal that was worked out with the Soviet Union. So, who knew? More about that later if you're interested, but we've got a lot to go through. So you have all this slag, this byproduct of the smelting process. What are you going to do with it? Well, it turned out that around this turn of the century, you had a couple things that all came about together. Thing one, Yacht Club. They were the Tacoma Yacht Club starting back in the 1880s, and they kind of went big for a couple of years, faded away, and then came back in 1908. They were looking for a new home for their clubhouse around 1913, 1914. So you have a yacht club. They were able to reach out to the park board, which itself was fairly new at this time, only 7 years old. And they wanted to figure out if there was a way they could use the edge of Point Defiance as a home base for their yacht club. So they were able to talk it out, and the result was the park district was open to it. They weren't sure if they had a good place, but they had an idea about building a breakwater to be able to create a better harbor for the yacht club and for recreational boating in general. One of the big attractions of Point Defiance Park was the waterfront. And so you had lots of folks using pleasure craft. You had rowboats you could borrow. There was a little pavilion. They had walk-on ferries that were coming to stop nearby. So there was a lot of water traffic at this time, and so the park board saw the benefit of building a breakwater to protect not only the yacht club's yachts, but also general recreational boating. So they worked to deal with the smelter to have the smelter build a breakwater to protect all of these boats out of the extra slag. It was recycling. Not perhaps ideal, as we now look back on the pollution that was present and continues to be present as a result of this smelting process. But at the time, they thought it was a great solution. So the yacht club moved in 1914. The conversation with ASARCO went back and forth between the years after that, and it wasn't until 1917 that they actually got to the point of signing an agreement where the smelter would dump all the slag in this breakwater according to those plans that were on the previous slide. This is kind of an outline of what was on the harbor. And then have the smelter build a railroad. They sunk piles, they built a railroad or lines for their rail cars to get out around the shape that they were looking for, and then dump the smelter directly into the water to build up enough slag to create a new landform. This is an image looking south towards the mountain again in the background, and you'll see people out rowing their boats and having a grand old time, and then in the background there is the smoke and the steam from the smelter, and you can see the beginnings of the breakwater being formed as well. This is a 1936 photo, so the slag peninsula has been building up already for about 20 years at that point. This is another image showing what you would have seen on the breakwater. There's the molten slag being poured out of those containers on the rail car coming from the smelting plant itself. And there's, of course, the smokestack dominating in the skyline in the back. It's a dramatic photo. I think it was possibly the coloring is due to the exposure, not necessarily that it was taken at night or anything, but it's a really, dramatic contrast of the orange molten slag and the dark blue surroundings. This is a photo showing you kind of what went into the smelting plant, like the different buildings that were there and the different processes of transforming ore into usable material. So it's courtesy of the Northwestern, most of these photos are, but it also is just a really good resource. So if you're interested in this, I'm happy to share some of these photos later so you can take a look in more detail. But it does show you the extent of the operation. It was not just, one plant, it was many, many buildings and very involved process. It was also directly next to a public park. Think about it. It wasn't, take a step out of the park and there you were, but it was just down the road. And it was a very noxious neighbor at times. These are postcards showing you the serenity of the pond there at the bowl of the park, and also the buffalo in their pens grazing with the smokestack and the smoke in the background. About the turn of this was 1914, 1917, and you had negotiation for the slag. Just before that, 1911, you had Hair landscape architects come out to Tacoma and write a master plan for the park on behalf of the park board. So, park district is formed in 1907. Park board members are elected to oversee this special district, and they begin getting down to business and looking ahead. We have this great resource at Point Defiance. We want to make sure that it's a park that is serving us and will serve us well long into the future. Hair came out to Tacoma from Missouri. They took a little time to look around the park, walking around the trails, observing the animals, and then wrote a report and some guidelines that basically still serve as our overall framework for how we manage Point Defiance Park today. But one of their observations was the plants were suffering as a result of acid rain from the smokestack and from the smelter next door. So they suggested maybe the park district should ask the smelter to add a filter to prevent as much pollution from getting out of the chimney, but they suggested some kind of negotiation needed to take place. There were various conversations over the years between the park board and ASARCO. Most of the time, whenever damage was observed for the plants in the park, ASARCO wrote a check to the park board in compensation. This was also the policy for when locals living in Ruston observed acid rain damaging the paint on their cars, or animals, small pets, may have got some illness or ate plants that had been exposed to the smelter plumes, fallout, and got sick or died. ASARCO would write you a check. It was cheaper than trying to add these filters or safety checks to their infrastructure. It was much cheaper for them to pay on incident. However, they were beholden to the city of Tacoma and certain local regulations, and so it wasn't like they could do all the polluting they want without any repercussions. And so, as kind of a gesture towards lessening the impact, they decided to make the chimney taller. So they went from 307-foot tall chimney to a 571-foot tall smokestack in 1917 as they were working on the breakwater, getting that built. And this was intended to disperse the particles more widely so you would have less immediate damage, which kind of worked, but that also meant that you now had a smelter plume that was spreading out not only over Tacoma, but also as far as Thurston County down to Olympia, and to our neighboring counties as well. So, kind of worked, kind of made things worse. This is a cool map from 1948 showing you the features of Point Defiance Park. You will note there is now a defined breakwater in that lower corner, and the yacht club is in that corner. So it is integrated now into the recreation amenities of Point Defiance Park in terms of protecting that harbor and allowing a place for boaters to be able to tie up safely. Slag, meanwhile, is continuing to pile up on the breakwater. This is a view looking at the harbor with the boats moored there, and you can see there's the flat breakwater. That was the easiest way. It was just little by little. They not only did it in a straight line, they curved around the end to have a little bit more protection from the wind and waves. And then they continue to keep building it up over the course of the next 30 years from that point. This is an aerial view of the smelter as well. Just again, kind of showing you the scale. That is Ruston there in the grid. That's the neighborhood. Still a town today. Still very proud of their community. This is a view looking down along Ruston Way with the mountain in the background from 1973. And I forgot to mention the slag was also used to actually make Ruston Way. In about 1920, when they were actually building the road, what's called First Street for a while, then came Ruston Way after that. They built it up using some of the slag that was produced by Sarco, and you had to negotiate with this park board because they had contracts. They had to agree to slightly less slag being poured for the park board's breakwater and a little bit more for the city of Tacoma. And there's also other places throughout Tacoma that would end up using slag as fill to help build the roads. So it's in more places than you think it is. Slag is made up of toxic arsenic and cadmium primarily, and that's why it's so poisonous, because these are forever chemicals, they don't go away. And so the smelter plume did send those kind of particles through the air, as well as the stuff that was left over in the actual slag itself. 1973 is when this photo is taken, and this is kind of the beginning of the end for Sarco. Now, we talk about Sarco now primarily with the negative connotation due to the pollution, but it was also one of the biggest employers in Tacoma, in the area. You had families who had made their livelihood thanks to employment at the plant. It provided steady employment. There were decent benefits and retirement packages. And so despite the fact that we have a legacy that's not so positive, for many folks this was the way that they made their families successful and able to live in this beautiful part of the world. So wanted to put that out there. We tend to we look back with a very specific viewpoint, but for the people who lived and grew up here and rested in Tacoma, it wasn't always as clear-cut as that. 1970 was the first day that first year that Tacoma celebrated Earth Day. So at that point, environmental consciousness had kind of caught up in many ways. As early as 1950, the smelter had actually finally put on those filters that Hare had asked about in 1911, and that was due to the growing pollution in Tacoma and the growing awareness of the negative impacts of that pollution. 1970, again, the 60s raised a lot of awareness of a lot of these issues. A Silent Spring came out in the 1960s, talking about the potentially devastating impacts of loss of species and loss of habitat. We also then faced many different crises in the 1970s, right? You had environmental crises, you had labor becoming more expensive, you had international challenges. And as a result of many of these tensions, Sarco was looking at their model and realizing it wasn't sustainable. So they kind of coasted along until the 1980s. They closed in 1986. But as early as the 1970s, it was already getting a little bit more of a difficult climate. So Sarco did finally close in 1986 due to what they termed a difficult copper market. So there was more overseas competition, and there was other ways people would just be able to get labor for cheaper in other parts of the world, and to make the whole process no longer cost effective to be produced in Tacoma, in Ruston. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has actually declared Ruston and the smelter a Superfund site, the Ruston smelter a Superfund site, in 1983. So Sarco knew that they were facing severe challenges and penalties for 3 years before they officially pulled the plug. So it was challenging times for the smelter in many ways. This is the smelter smokestack coming down. In 1993, if you were in Tacoma or Ruston, you probably knew this was happening and may have even gone out to watch. Continuing the tale of Dune Peninsula, we were just talking about the beginnings of the Waterfront Phase 1 project, as it was known internally. This project came out of conversations in the 1990s between City of Tacoma, Ruston, the Park Board, and the EPA, and a Sarco settlement conversation. So the breakwater was owned by the park board, since they were the ones who allowed the slide to be poured and the agreement was created in the first place with their governance. So we knew that part was going to be owned by the park board, but the vision for what it would become was still a little bit up in the air. But over the course of the early 2000s, the vision solidified, and we got to the point where we realized we could do a pretty cool park on that breakwater. So this is a slide showing you some of the early planning concept designs that came about as early as 2001, and the long-term planning that was underway even as early as that point. The park that we know today opened in 2019. It was under construction for about 3 years, and the planning, as I just mentioned, went all the way back to 2001, but it was really getting ramped up in the early, 2014, thanks to the voter-approved bond. The funding was made available to support this vision, and then over the next couple of years, the design work got more involved. It was, in fact, the design team that brought an artist on board as part of that work. It's Site Workshop is the name of the architectural and engineering firm that helped oversee the whole development of the project. They brought on artist Adam Kumi, who helped them visualize on the ground with things like balloons. This was a photo taken at the breakwater, and you can see it was still flat. That is just the weeds that have grown up on top of the slag with whatever soil and moss and scraggly plants made their home there. But the balloons in this photo show you where the shape of the hills would be. So from that early design, they knew they wanted to make some really dramatic hill forms on top of the breakwater to break it up a little bit, to do more visually interesting things. You can also see farther from up there, so it allows you to get a better view of the surrounding mountains, Vashon, and of course Puget Sound itself. The overall kind of theme that emerged out of this design process was looking at the history of the breakwater and looking at themes of layers and accretion. So you had the layers of slag that were added to build this landform, and just kind of the confluence of nature and man-made structures there. This is a photo of the slag itself and the train cars that brought it to the breakwater from the next door smelter. You can see on one of those, it's kind of a dome shape, right? And that is looking at one of the pieces that came off the rail car. The rail car itself, there's one incident that it fell into the water. It was too close to the edge of the breakwater, and the slag gave way, so it did in fact dump it into the water unintentionally, but they also intentionally poured it at the beginning and then furthermore layered it on top in order to build the right size and shape of breakwater. But it's still there. Like we did work on the top to cover everything over and make it safe to use the park, but by and large, the slag, can't really pull it out at this point. We didn't armor the edges of the breakwater, so it's not going to leach into the water anymore. And there's layers of soil and membrane cap, as well as rocks, and then another layer of soil that currently forms the park as we know it today. So there's lots of layers that were added. The hill forms themselves were built by pulling some of the contaminated dirt from the other side of the harbor, where the Wilson Way Bridge area and the new parking lot is. They scraped a lot of the contaminated soil off the top there and then moved it over to the breakwater to build up those hills. So it was a combination of aesthetics as well as practicalities that made that part of the design. Here's another view of the molten slag being poured onto the breakwater. And I put this picture again, even though we saw it earlier in the slideshow, because this is also showing you what those kettles looked like, the actual vessels that brought the slag from the smelter to the breakwater. You can see in the picture, it's about 1/3 the size of a train car. We have today on the park the oversized version of a similar kettle. So if you walk into Dune Peninsula, you'll see that giant kind of concave shape. That is a smelter kettle from a phosphorus smelter. So a little bit bigger than the ones that they used at our lead and copper smelter in Ruston, but similar in shape, similar in function. And that was added as an aesthetic choice by our design team, since they really wanted to have some kind of an iconic moment there to mark the entryway if you're walking along the waterfront to get into the park. Our artist, Adam Kuby, also was commissioned to create a standalone piece of art for the park. So he created the metal sculpture that you see if you were parking right there at the main part of the Dune Peninsula and then walk in, you will have walked past it. It's called Alluvion, and it is made out of corten steel pipes. And so the idea there is referencing the iconic smokestack that was part of the smelter and part of Tacoma's landscape and Ruston's landscape for so long, and then imagining what if you broke it up into smaller and smaller pieces, speaking to that layering, speaking to that accretion theme of what the land you're standing on when you're standing on the park was built up into small pieces that came out of the smelter, and the smelter smokestack itself was demolished into those small pieces once again. So here's another shot of the alluvion piece being installed. The intent is that you are able to walk through at certain points. There are gravel pathways that you are permitted to walk on, and then there are planned areas where you are not allowed to walk for protection of the art piece and visitors. But when you walk along those gravel paths in between the rows, you get a different perspective of the artwork and can kind of play with the perspective of the small pieces looking up to the full smokestack, as well as looking back the other direction to the smaller pieces. Along with this art installation, Adam also and the design team, called for benches to be added along the park walkways that included the themes of layering by intentionally leaving exposed kind of concrete edges where you can see layers of sand, cobbles, and ore, including kind of like coppery pieces. And that again speaks to the history of the site being made by layers, and also the ore itself being extracted from the earth before it was brought to the Ruston smelter. So keep your eye out for that next time you're walking around the park. Later on in the design process, we had brought in a sign consultant team, and they helped design our signs for the park. And this also called on the layering theme. So you will see around the park there are signs with the embellishment added to the edges of them. So keep your eyes open for little Easter eggs there. We have a layer of acrylic in many of these that have a little object inside, and those objects relate to the story of the breakwater of Tacoma and Ruston. I will confess some of the acrylic has aged better than others, so sometimes it's really foggy, and others are a little more clear, so I can't promise that you'll be able to see all the items clearly, but keep your eyes open for them next time you're around the park. And then again, this design firm also helped us create the overall language of the signs, and also called for the looking tubes that you get to look through as you're enjoying the park. That kind of highlight certain mountain ranges and other features that you get to look out over. Including there is one tube that points you to look up the hill towards where the smokestack used to be. In addition to these artistic elements, we also have interpretive signage at the point and at Dune Peninsula. There's 5 signs throughout the park talking about the history, different areas where we have one called Ashes of Industry, talking about the smelter in more detail. There's another one called Taking the Air, about the recreation history and kind of the boating history, as well as a little bit about the waterfront and the first aquarium, which was actually down at the waterfront. There's another one talking about the haven for wildlife that was intentionally designed as part of the park. If you look out towards the Vashon kind of side, it's in between, Browns Point and Ruston, and the Vashon side, Maury Island. Look out toward Maury Island. If you look over the edge there, you'll see the haven for wildlife, and that's where we have lots of our seals, and sometimes sea lions, and lots of other critters that make their home along the waterfront there. And then we also have a sign talking about the history of Dune Peninsula, and why we called it Dune Peninsula, which I know you're all really eager to get to that part of the story, and we're almost there, I promise. The other kind of Easter egg is to look for ground plane medallions, we call them. These are the little plates that have quotes from Frank Herbert, as well as other relevant information about the native area, native plants and animals, and a little bit more about the smelter if you get up along the walkway up to the bridge to Point Defiance Park. So keep your eyes open for those. They have mostly quotes, but some of the little tidbits as well. All right. Finally, why do we call it Dune? This is a cover art from a British edition of the book Dune by Frank Herbert. And I just like that it's got, typical 1980s, in this case, sci-fi elements there and some great colors. So this is my favorite version of the cover art today. Dune, the book, was published in 1965 by Frank Herbert, who is a Tacoma native. He grew up here. People often, will cite the sand dunes of Oregon as being the primary inspiration for this book. There's debate about exactly what it was that created this book, but we can tell you for sure that being from Tacoma, growing up here in the 30s and 40s, and living across the water in the 1950s, when Tacoma was one of the most polluted areas along this coast, influenced Frank Herbert about these topics of environmentalism, about indigenous rights, about the impact of humans on their environment. The book Dune, of course, is centered on a fictional planet that has been depleted of its water as a result of terraforming and the side effects thereof. And we named Dune Peninsula after this book because of this need to be aware of our impact on the natural world and terraforming as a concept. We did, in fact, terraform this breakwater by building it up from nothing with the byproduct of a smelting process. And then we've also terraformed it once more in the recent history by making it into a park and making it usable space. Frank Herbert lived across from the smelter on Marine View Drive, kind of over in Browns Point area. And so he would have seen the smelter plume out his window and the smoke from the smokestack there, along with all the other industrial sites along the waterfront. And this very much was part of his consciousness as he grew up and moved away and started thinking about sci-fi topics. He also, there's great stories about him growing up in Tacoma, taking a canoe and a rowboat out, but there's also stories about him learning from indigenous people who lived around Point Defiance and Salmon Beach area as well. So there is a very local connection to Point Defiance and to the Dune Peninsula from Frank Herbert's own childhood, as well as his later years as this author who kind of brought environmental topics into mainstream sci-fi for the first time. So we owe him a lot. It's a great way to celebrate an author who, kind of changed the dynamics of what you can do with sci-fi in some ways, and also speaks to the history of not only his own growing up years in Tacoma, but also how far we've come in general for Tacoma. So we also have to give credit for the name Dune Peninsula to Park Board member Eric Hanberg, who is himself a local author, and he was an advocate for it. He did not choose that name. He did, in fact, put the names out to vote to the public, so you all got to weigh in on what the name of this new Peninsula Park would be. So thank you for participating there, but he was definitely a cheerleader for it, and so we were thrilled to be able to help his vision come to life and to be able to celebrate a Tacoma author and a great story. So lots of folks involved in this park, for sure. Another element of the sci-fi that came into the park was through our second commissioned artwork for the park, which was a piece by Nicole Rathburn. She works at the Two Ravens Foundry right here in Tacoma and is an artist in her own right. She created a piece for what we call Sail Mound B, which is the second of the big hills there. She created a piece inspired by the sandworms of Dune and titled it Little Makers, which is the name of the larval form in the book. They also go by the nickname sand trout. But on this slide is a sketch and also a mock-up of the original concept design for these worm forms, and then there they are installed at Dune Peninsula. So they were placed on this kind of diamond-shaped pedestal that is evocative not only of the terraced nature of the other land forms on the park, but also calls out kind of the shape of the mountain behind them. So from a certain angle, you can look along the center of that little terrace and see Mount Rainier framed directly behind it. And Nicole installed the worms in order to kind of enhance that view and not obstruct it. So take a look next time you're out there. There's another picture showing you kind of the angle that you can even position yourself a little bit more directly in the line of the mountain. But many people know it as Mount Rainier. We also know it as Mount Tacoma. And so this is one of the latest updates we've added to the park in the last couple of years. In 24 and 25, one of the looking tubes was getting some of the paint peeling off of it, and when we went to replace it, we decided this is our opportunity to add the Shootsy out there in the park space. And so we added not just Tacoma, but also Tacoma to the name, since the indigenous people do not have a single name for the mountain. They have many names for what we call Mount Rainier, and which gives Tacoma its name by another version of that name of the mountain. So next time you're out there, take a look. We will hopefully eventually be able to add additional Shootsy words, but we haven't replaced any of the other looking tubes at this point. So we haven't added any more of the other mountain names, but we have things like, we'll probably slowly add more as we replace them. This is just a view of our beautiful mountain in the sunrise, I believe, possibly sunset actually, along the looking tube. So I'm sure if you've been out to the point, you will have seen this view or something similar to it. There's also, you can see some of the plantings in that view from the peninsula, and this is another opportunity to highlight that the design of the Peninsula Park also included native prairie grasses and intentionally left. We have some manicured lawns for events and such, but we also have prairie landscape in order to encourage pollinators, in order to encourage more of the natural life returning to that site, and to help visitors become aware of what this area used to look like when there was a lot more prairie in South Puget Sound, and in Pierce County especially. So it's an opportunity to reflect on where we've come from and where we go, and our ability to make changes in our environment, and in some cases rectify the errors of the past. Finally, this is a view of the waterfront from about the 1920s, showing you that smokestack looming over the boathouse and the ferry terminal, where folks are recreating in boats and on water skis and all sorts of fun stuff, reminding us that this was a part of life for a long time. That smelter was taken for granted. It was just there, and people kind of assumed it was always going to be there, and now it's gone. So another view of we're all part of history. We all make history by our choices every day. There is a quote that my predecessor, Melissa McGinnis, found, and I will continue to share out because it's a great quote. But it says, "History is too often seen as a neat, sanitary place with definite limits, cordoned off from the real world by white picket fences labeled history, instead of as a dimension within which we live, a continuum from which we spring." So we are all part of history, and it's never as neat and tidy as we think it is, but there is so much more to learn from it. And so thank you for your attention today. I'm sorry if it was a little bit scattershot. The snow threw us off, but we persevere anyway. So thank you for joining us, and I'm always happy to take questions by email, or we can set up another day to do a tour. Happy to do walking tours of the peninsula as well.